Welcome to NBF Presents Poetry and Protest. I'm Natalie Green, the National Book Foundation's Public Programs Manager. We're so grateful to share the screen with 4 bright lights this evening. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for supporting NBF Presents. The National Book Foundation is best known as the presenter of the National Book Awards, which honor the best literature in America. The awards fuel our year-round work to reach readers of all ages all over the country. So far, we've visited libraries, colleges, book festivals, and performance centers in 40 states. The pause on in-person programming meant a rain check on plans to visit the University of Central Missouri in Warrensburg last spring. So we're thrilled to give them a special shout out tonight. Thanks to Jenny Molberg and the rest of the UCMO crew, we were able to get copies of tonight's featured authors' books into students' hands. A special hello to all the students, staff, and faculty joining us tonight. Book distributions to students, public housing communities, prisons, and detention centers across the U.S., alongside our free year-round education and public programming, wouldn't be possible without your help. If you're able to, please consider donating at nationalbook.org/donate. And now for tonight's program. Toi Derricotte, Camonghne Felix, and Terrance Hayes chat with Kyle Dacuyan on the impact of protest poetry. We'll share the link to buy their books with gratitude to our season's bookseller partner, Loyalty Bookstores. Real-time live captioning is available and linked to in the chat, thanks to our captioner, Lisa Johnston. At the end, we'll open up to a few questions from the audience. You can submit those questions for the authors directly into the YouTube live chat at any point during the conversation. And now a little bit more about our guests. Toi Derricotte is the author of 5 poetry collections, most recently, New and Selected Poems, a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award. She is also the author of The Black Notebook, winner of the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for Nonfiction. She is the recipient of 3 Pushcart Prizes, the Penn Volker Award for Poetry, the Lucille Medwick Memorial Award, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. She is the founder, along with poet Cornelis Eady, of Camonghne, the preeminent organization devoted to the development and support of Black poetry in the United States, for which she has been awarded the National Book Foundation's Literarian Award and Poets House Elizabeth Cray Award for service to the field of poetry. Born and raised in Detroit, she currently lives in Pittsburgh. Camonghne Felix is a poet, writer, speaker, and political strategist. She received an MA in Arts Politics from NYU, an MFA from Bard College, and has received fellowships from Camonghne, Callaloo, and Poets House. Her first full-length collection of poems, Build Yourself a Boat, was longlisted for the 2019 National Book Award for Poetry and a finalist for the 2019 Lambda Literary Awards. Felix's forthcoming collection of poems, Dyscalculia, and collection of essays, Let the Poets Govern, are forthcoming from One World. Camonghne was the director of surrogates and strategic communications at Elizabeth Warren for President, and is now the head of strategic communications at the agency Blue State. Terrance Hayes is the author of 6 award-winning poetry collections, including American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin, a finalist for the National Book Award, and Lighthead, winner of the 2010 National Book Award for Poetry. His prose collection, To Float in the Space Between, Drawings and Essays in Conversation with Etheridge Knight, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and winner of the Pegasus Award for Poetry Criticism. Hayes has received fellowships from the MacArthur, Guggenheim, and Whiting Foundations, and is a professor of English at New York University. And our moderator, Kyle Dacuyan, is a poet, performance maker, and executive director of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's. His book, Incitements, is forthcoming from Ugly Duckling Press in 2022, and he is a 2021 NEA Creative Writing Fellow. And I'll let them take it away. Enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in. Thank you so much to the poets who are speaking tonight. Our conversation is poetry in protest. And it feels necessary to acknowledge that we are having this conversation within a context of grief that is both particular and pernicious. Our gathering right now follows weeks of anti-Black, racist gun violence, and specifically fatal violence perpetrated by police. And while these systems of violence and oppression are not at all new, I think these poets remind us that every loss calls for new pause, grief, reflection, action. And I thank Toi Derricotte, Camonghne Felix, and Terrance Hayes for their work, which has been so sustaining and courageous and provocative through so many different kinds of turbulence and pain. I thank you for the tremendous generosity of your poetry, and I thank you for inspiring us. I feel incredibly grateful that we have work that will be shared tonight that's, newly been prepared from this moment. And so it's really special that we're actually going to open this conversation with a reading from Toi Derricotte.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It's such an honor to be with writers I care so much about, Terrance and Camonghne. And I have to explain, I have this crown on my head because I'm 80 years old this month, and I'm celebrating. So I was thinking a lot about protest, and I think every poem that a Black poet writes is a protest poem. We weren't supposed to write, as we well know from slavery. And when I was in college and graduate school, I never read a Black poet. And that's why Camonghne came about, the workshop retreat for African American poets in 1996. There's a quote from a historian, William Banks, in 1837, said, "Many slaves who learned to write did indeed achieve freedom by this method." And I thought of all of the Camonghne poets who might say that about their work, that they achieved freedom through writing poetry. In my work, I'm led to unbury what's unconscious. As long as it's buried, it stinks. Audre Lorde famously said, "Shame keeps us silent, and silent keeps everything the same." When I unbury what stinks, I mean it as a protest. When I was about 20, someone attacked me. I was getting in my car, and the person pushed me down, and he had a knife, and he said, "Don't scream." And I started screaming. And he said, "I'm going to have to kill you then." And I said, "Well, you're going to have to kill me then." And something in me said, "Who said that?" I didn't say that. But there was some voice, and then I had to stand up for that voice. So it's taken many years to say joy is an act of resistance, but most of the good that comes from that comes to the world from me comes because of the internal work I've done, the protesting of what was silenced in me. I saw Aretha, the movie. She's my girlfriend. I never met her, but we lived on the same street in Detroit. And I heard all the gossip, of course, in my neighborhood about what was going on with Aretha. And this brilliant woman, this genius, had a complicated life, and the movie showed that. One of the things it showed that she had a child when she was 12. It never said who the father was, but her father also fathered a child by a 12-year-old girl. And when the actor C.L. Franklin was questioned by Terry Gross about the father not really saying clearly how the movie felt about the father, he said, it's tricky. He said, you don't know a person until you're in their shoes. Everyone of color was harmed. There's nowhere for them to get relief from their pain, and they turn to the innocent ones, the women and the children, Black women and Black children. Is it right? Is it wrong? No, but it happened. There's a lot that I think we need to look back on and have an attitude about. So I think the protests are very much about changing laws and what we have the power to do. And I also think at the same time, we have to look at the inside stuff. So I'm just going to read one poem, and it's called When the Goddess Makes Love to Me, and it's about making art. And I've written very much about my father's violence to me and others in my childhood. And this is the poem. When the goddess makes love to me, she has to pass through my father. She has to find him where he sits in a corner inside me, cold as a turd. I can't reach him anymore. I don't have the strength to yank him out and blow on his breasts. She has to tuck her fingers between his thighs and warm him slowly. First the shoulders and the tops of his arms. She has to coax the crying boy to come through the dead, walking on tiptoe. Sometimes he can't find his way, feeling in the dark with his blunt fingers. And sometimes he stands there, dumbstruck, his body trembling between us like a little bird's. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toi, for opening up our conversation with such a rich and complex field. I'm really feeling from your reading the different ways that the three of you are writing into memory, writing relative to record, and thinking about the ways that poetry sort of changes our relationship to record. Camonghne, I'm so reminded of your book by the poem that Toi just read. It feels like there are so many resonances of kind of reflection on childhood. And a question that I want to pose to you first, but then also turn to the rest of the group is, what do you think poetry can do for the future with the lived material of the past?
That's a great question. Thanks, Kyle. And also just want to say thank you so much to the National Book Foundation for having me, and to all of you who are watching. I'm very honored to be here today with two of my OGs and also a good friend, Kyle. I'm feeling very at home. And the question, what can poetry do for the future? You know, I was going to say something contrived, but I'm going to be honest. I've been really struggling to answer that question lately. I feel like I had an answer to it a year ago. And maybe even 2 years ago, I had an answer to it. But this last year has really complicated that answer for me. So I think that poetry is going to do for the future what it has always done in the past for the future, right? Which is to catalog, to leave space for analogs, right? To be able to find people and conversations that are directly in alignment with conversations that other people just aren't having, right? An opportunity to identify yourself within a canon, to be able to say oh, there are people who are doing a kind of thinking and a kind of expanding that precedes me. But do I think that poetry will transform our like moral bed, I don't know. I think that poets are more likely to do that. I think that the function of poetics outside of the actual sort of application on the page of poetics, right? Like poetics, poetic theory, poetic pedagogy, right? Can do more for the world, I think, than poems, material poems may. That's not to say that poems won't do anything. I just have a little bit more faith in poets and the way that we complicate thought processes and systems of thinking. And I think, you know, I'm prioritizing the poets over the poems in this conversation only because I think so often when people ask me questions like this, and not that you are at all, because I know you, right? But so often when people are asking this question, they're removing the poet from the poem. They're asking, like, what is the function of this artifice, right? Of a book or of a piece of paper? And the answer is, I don't know. But I know that the function of poetics is to break open conversations in ways that we haven't seen them before. Is also to remind the human condition of the fact that it lives within a body that has nerves and is receptive to feeling, and that we all are receptive to each other. That's as far as I've gotten in the last 6 months. Yeah.
Thank you for taking us right into candor. I wanted to talk about the limitations of this conversation too, as much as all of the kind of opportunity and imperative that poetry presents within this field of protest. And I feel super grateful and honored that I'm talking with three people who, in addition to being incredible poets on the page, are also, you know, remarkable infrastructuralists, people who are building community and changing policy and changing the way we think of scholarship. Terrance, I'm so enamored of your book on Etheridge Night, and I'm thinking about kind of the deep and original reading that's happening in that work, and which I think is really, for me, has totally altered and expanded my sense of how poetry and protest function in relation to one another. You know, Camonghne is pressing us to think about this not just at the language level, but at the person level too, the level of what we do as people in the world. Maybe a way that I want to try to present this to you is what's been radical for you in the study and care of poetry, in that level of exchange, the deep study and reading of poetry.
I can try to make it very clean for you and say, you know, that's so rooted in how I teach. It's great to be here with y'all, and it's always great to be here with Toi, who is like my first and last teacher, you know, alpha and omega, very literally that, you know. So I just sort of take that lead. Everything I'm usually doing is sharing. I don't think of teaching, and this again would come from Toi and like even how Kyle Dacuyan is built. I don't really think of teaching as like a pyramid kind of thing where I'm bestowing information. I think of it as like an open space. We're sharing things, we're teaching each other how to be vulnerable, how to be expressive. So that idea is just like, as long as I'm sort of paying attention to teaching, I feel like that's probably the most political thing I do. I do other things, you know, I go out in the community, but like my sort of regular task where I can totally manage this question would be in that sort of classroom space, conference center space, prison conference, you know, wherever I've taught poems, I think of that. So that, you know, the Night book is trying to do that. I was working on something for about 2 months on Gwendolyn Brooks and Toi about sort of saying like, where do you really look to learn things about like American poetry? I mean, one of the big things I wrote in this essay was like, you know, clearly Gwendolyn Brooks should have won the Nobel, you know, so that's the largest of her contribution to the last century in terms of poetry. And I think of, you know, Toi similarly, it's like her niece or something in terms of so much of it is just like laying hands on young people, so to speak. So that again is how I think about teaching too, like just getting right in front of them and having interactions. But again, the primary thing I'm saying is like that circle of teaching, whatever that looks like, is where I think the most work is done.
Yeah. Toi, your commitment to community has been so expansively world building. I think, you know, Terrance is identifying that you are this incredible connector of generations. And I'm wondering, what do you think about this relationship of poetry to generations in exchange? How does poetry, or how do poets make room for voices or presences for whom there hasn't been room before? Oh, Toi, you're on mute.
Yeah. I think there's something that is either in Black people or they get it early in childhood. I know for me, it was walking in my neighborhood, and people at that time had radios, and they would open their windows and let the music of either church music or, we were getting stations with Black music at that time, let the music drift through the neighborhood. So you'd walk through the neighborhood and hear the latest Black songs, or the latest church. And I think in some way, something is communicated. I was also going to say about Congo Square in New Orleans, when the slaves in the early 1800s didn't speak the same language because they came from different places in Africa. They would gather and they would dance and play music. They didn't have to speak the same language. So I think there's something that comes of community. And I think Cave Canem, when Black poets who had never seen another Black poet saw 50 Black poets together, there was something that came alive. And so I think for me, finding the people that I felt most comfortable with, most loving toward, was an act of just connecting. And it was connecting to the truth in my own poetry, because I felt accepted for who I truly was. And I think other people felt accepted for who they were really. They didn't have to be anything but themselves, as much as possible, of course.
Camonghne and Terrance, both of you have sort of spoken to how important that experience has been for you as a learner too. I'm wondering if you want to respond to to Toi's perspective from this position of like, how has being in a learning community, how has that been activating for you?
Yeah. The best example I have is, Kyle, you've heard me talk about this before. When I started my MFA program at Bard, I was 20. And I was the youngest person in my program. I was the only Black person in my program. The only person of color in my program, period. No, except for Laylee Long Soldier. So there were two of us. But, that first week that I got there, I was super hungry. I was like, okay, they're going to teach me stuff that I've never seen before. They're going to blow my mind. And, I remember like the first workshop, I was like, my mind's not blown. I thought it was going to be blown. It's not blown. And so Fred Moten came back to Bard that week. And, he said a really important thing to me that really changed me, where he was like, we were talking about Build Yourself a Boat. That was at the very beginnings of putting that collection together. And he was like, listen, my advice to you is don't listen to any of them. Don't listen to anybody here. He was like, they don't know what you're doing because they've never seen it before. So you have to find your people, and you already know who your people are. I'm your people. Cave Canem is your people, right? Mahogany Brown is your people. These are your people. So it's going to be really hard for you to be in this program working on this thesis and not be able to get feedback from people who are your direct peers and colleagues and professors. But you can't listen to them because their imagination can't conceive of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that was the most important lesson for me, because it's not just about the sort of emotional and kinetic reaction to being in conversation with people that you just sort of like know and understand at a cellular level. But it's also about understanding really who your teachers are. And that's not to say that you can't learn from anybody. You can certainly learn from anybody. There are plenty of non-Black poets who I'm, deeply indebted to in my own trajectory. But that's going back to what we talked about earlier. Having a canon, being able to say, I belong to these people, means that when I'm genuinely stuck in my craft, when I really can't answer a question, I know the people I need to either be around, be in conversation with, or go to help me answer that question. And to me, that's the most radical part of being in this community and being in community with people who you understand and people who you're willing to be vulnerable with and to love, is because the questions never go away. And the questioning, I think, is functional to the act of making poems. But if you can't talk to people who are going to give you the answers, or at least point you in the direction of the answer that you need, then you'll end up on the other side of the world. And I'm not trying to end up there. I'm trying to go over here with the Blacks. So it's been really helpful. That's been my sort of like orienting principle. Is like, I know where I can get the answer from, and it's the people over here. And that's what keeps me writing. But Terrance.
In the UK, Nick McCullough, who has come through Camonghne, has started, I think they had a digital meeting with a kind of UK version of it, Obsidian. I think we know over here, Kundeman and many other organizations, I think just even not directly replicating what Camonghne does, have thought about what it means to like put a whole bunch of people in the room together. So what I said to Nick when he was talking about this is like, well, if you do this in 10 years, you probably have a Black prime minister. Because I'm like, that's directly related to Camonghne and Barack Obama. Like, what is the resonance of putting a whole bunch of like spiritual, weird, cosmic people in a space together? Like, where does that energy go? I mean, it winds up, one of those people becomes like the inaugural poet. That's Elizabeth Alexander. So I'm trying to make a direct relationship between what everybody's talking about in terms of like the intimacy that's required to feel safe. And then like, where does that energy go? That really is the question for me. Like, always trying to get out of the classroom. One of the ongoing questions, and I think it's still a question for Camonghne, is always the idea. If I said to you this thing about the circle, the power of that circle of us looking at each other, and Toi knows I've been talking about this for 20 years. I think at some point everybody has like to turn around and face that energy. So we're still in a circle, but we're looking in a different direction in that circle. So that gesture is where I'm always trying to get to. Even in my teaching, it's always like, where does this energy go? What do you do with the stuff? These tools that we've given you, these weapons that we've given you, where do they go? So the big response is what I was saying to Nick. I said it too to my, I have a friend who's from Iraq, and I was like, y'all should get it together. Like, you should have a Muslim Camonghne or Islam Camonghne or something. Just bringing brown people together and, from another part of the world, get them in the room and let them write poems. And she said, the CIA would be in there. And I was like, yeah, that'd be good. They were there when Sonia Sanchez started the Black Studies in the late 60s. It's good for them to get that education. So I guess I'm saying, and people do understand that power of getting together, to go to Camonghne's point. Like, and I'm saying to you, there are results of that. People think you're just getting there like a family reunion. And I'm saying, like, down the road, you do see the results. And again, it's kind of evidence. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say these things. You can kind of see the relationship from that gathering to like, where we get to. Of course, we're back in another space now. So none of these things are fixed, obviously. But that energy, I guess that's why it has to be consistent. That's why the circle has to kind of keep holding through everything, because of the way that history goes up and down with these things.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love what you said about the intimacy that's required to feel safe and what radiates out from that. And I'm wondering, can poems effectuate that? Can we find that in poems? Are we finding that in poems right now? Are we finding that intimacy that's required to feel safe, that inspires us to action?
I think even if you do find it, it's like, what about it? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I say, yes, some of us do. I certainly do. I think, sometimes my response is to try to make a poem. Sometimes my response is to find somebody else's poem. But the idea of just trying to like create some other kind of conversation to get your hands on whatever it is, trauma, drama, karma, all of those kinds of ideas that kind of can get in front of our safe space. So I sort of like, you're just always trying to wrestle with those things. I was saying something to someone the other day about anger. I was saying, I think about anger the same way I think about extreme joy. Like, they both are things to be managed in the poem. Both of them can like make you run afoot of other stuff, you know. And I'm talking about like, again, like how do you shape? What are you trying to do with this stuff? That's the way I manage it. I'm not saying that's the way everybody else does, but for me, I'm always trying to make something tangible out of, you know, every day, I guess. So certainly, you know, protest gets folded into that, and confusion, uncertainty. The thing that I think, again, that's implied here when I think about what Toi does, is like vulnerability. How is vulnerability powerful? How is vulnerability a strength? You know, how is being open a strength? All those kinds of ideas are enfolded in like what she writes. That's what that poem is about for me. And so I think, you know, you're just trying to extend that kind of idea, you know, in your own work, this idea of openness, vulnerability as a kind of strength as opposed to something else.
I think it would be great. Go ahead, Toi.
I was just going to say, it appears to me now, I mean, I wouldn't have known this 40 years ago when I first started writing and writing into my own things I was ashamed of and wouldn't talk about, vulnerability and being vulnerable. And after a reading, instead of feeling good, feeling like, oh my God, everybody hates me because, you know, I've revealed these terrible, shameful things, and feeling so naked. But what I was saying is that conversely, the way we think about power is being invulnerable. You know, this is the white male idea of power, to be invulnerable. And yet, in the circle of these people that I'm talking about, what I've seen where the power comes from is connecting and loving and being able to be vulnerable. It's almost like the power is released when you can be vulnerable. And it flows into the universe, you know, like Lucille Clifton said, you know, you gain power. And, you know, so that's what I've noticed, how power is gained in vulnerability.
I think
all the stuff that's in that video I made, maybe, you know, Lucille's in there, and this idea of vulnerability and relationship between joy and anguish, responding to this stuff. I feel like, yeah, it's just all real-time stuff. You know, this is just everyday stuff. So these conversations always lead back to, you know, what do you do about it? How do you make something in response to these moments?
And it would be great, I think, to turn to that video now as we're having this conversation about practice and vulnerability. So maybe while we queue up this video, I want to remind the audience that you're welcome to pose questions too. And in a little bit of time, we'll be sharing questions from the audience. So feel free to put those forward, and we'll turn now to this video piece from Terrance.
Jasper, Texas, 1998. I am a man's head hunched in the road. I was chosen to speak by the members of my body. The arm, as it pulled away, pointed toward me. The hand opened once and was gone. Why and why and why should I call a white man brother? Who is the human in this place? The thing that is dragged or the dragger? What does my daughter say? The sun is a blister overhead. If I were alive, I could not bear it. The townsfolk sing, "We shall overcome," while hope drains slowly from my mouth into the dirt which covers us all. I am done with this dust. I am done.
I went to the store. 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 I went to the store.
Thank you, Terrance, for sharing that work with us. I think it would introduce a lot into this conversation to hear from you where the impulse for assembly comes from with this material in response to, the pieces titled after Dante Wright. Where does the collage making and an assembly impulse come out of?
I mean, the first thing I would say just about what poets do is, we just make things, and that's the root of the word, the Greek root of the word. So to me, that means like everything gets absorbed into that gesture of making. So, I draw, I do other stuff. I don't really think of it in terms of like expertise. Again, this is still connected to the question of vulnerability. So much as just trying to like get the stuff that's inside out. So if I separate the teaching thing, like that's very tangible. Like I can control that space. I like goals and people are in front of me. But the rest of it, you just sort of letting the work tell you what's going on. So just in short, I think there's a few new television shows out. There's this one show with the kid. It's like a Groundhog Day on Netflix. He's not able to get home. I don't know if y'all know, every time he goes out, the cop kills him. There's a few other shows. And so I just got I'm not on any social media, but stuff washes ashore sometimes. So this conversation about like Black depictions of violence, depictions of Black people. And I was trying to think about the first time I had seen someone get killed on screen. And I thought about this movie, Cornbread Earl and Me, which has Larry Fishburne in it. And I really had thought I must have been about 10 when I'd seen it. I've thought that for years because I remember the orange juice. That's Jamal Wilkes. He's a basketball player. So I've always thought that being like the first time I saw it. But when I looked the movie up, it was 75 that it came out, which means I was like 4 or 5 in the theater. I saw it in the theater. I just didn't even know I had that early of a memory. So that just reconfigured it. And so a lot of stuff just comes together around that. The song has, to me, it sounds like they're saying Floyd, Floyd, Floyd. I went to the store. So, that's what George Floyd was doing. So I'm just sort of creating a lot of different kinds of conversations. Lucille Clifton's piece is about James Byrd from 1998. So I don't know if it's like super logical or it's as logical as poems are when I'm doing this stuff. And then finally, I'll say, this is usually what I'm doing while I'm thinking about poems. Sometimes this work is just a way of thinking about what I will do with language inevitably. So I find I'm just like in this space, I get to show this stuff more. How about that? Like now that we're in Zoom, I've sort of in the last year began to show these things that I've always done, for years and years, but just as a sort of way of working through things, not necessarily for something to be in a museum or shown to anyone. But it's the same process of working on poems for me and not really trying to have too much around genre or even around expertise, but just seeing what comes when you try to respond.
And the video piece reminds me that something else I appreciate about the work that the three of you do, again, in very different ways, is I really just experience and sense time totally differently when I'm inside of your poems. And I think about the ways our experiences of time are differently inflected with obligation and fear and oppression, but also joy and surprise and pleasure. And I'm wondering how you think poetry can change our experience of time, and if there's a disobedience in that, if there's something radical in that. Camonghne, I would love to pose that to you. I felt so, my sense of time expanded and contracted in so many ways as I was moving through your book. And I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts about how time functions for poets and the way that linear time functions versus nonlinear time. I mean, I'll start with something that I've been thinking about a lot is, the title of DMX's album, Hell is Hot. I think often about the fact that when he wrote that, he was in the middle of coming out of a cycle of addiction. And he was also writing this album, obviously. And I think to myself, like, all of the different ways that title does work for the album, but also the work that it does for him and sort of his orientation in the world. It felt like he was saying that he was both alive and dead and like living in between both worlds at the same time, almost as if he was saying that like death preceded him and was also ahead of him and was where he was in that moment. And I think that's the most important thing that poets, or I don't want to say the most important thing, I'm hyperbolizing, but I think it is a really unique thing that poets are able to do, is to flatten time and condense it into one frame, but into a frame that can last seconds or months or years or centuries. And it's what happens in that frame that matters, right? Not necessarily the amount of time that it took. And so even like the way that we calculate time becomes less important in that framework, right? Because when you realize that you can actually quantify it and that the fact of it being quantifiable is not what's important, but the density of it, how big time can get, how much you can do or how little you choose to do in that space of time, that's always something that has like really like gotten to the core of me about and why I love poetry. Gosh, I was going to say one other thing and then I forgot. I like really get jazzed up when we talk about time and poets. I mean, truly.
Well, I wonder, I feel like similarly inspired just to listen to you riff on this. Do you think there's a relationship with that to protest?
For sure. My favorite thing these last couple of years, especially being part of like protest movements, have been when people say like, this has never happened before, or we're the first. And I'm like, oh my God, I want that to be true for you so bad because you really believe it, right? But just the notion, right? Like that. So we actually are living in a lineage, right? Especially as Black people who are doing protest and movement and activist work. We are living in a cyclical time, building on resources that were both given to us in the past and resources that are going to come to us in the future. And so, you know, I remember when Black Lives Matter was happening, or the sort of height of Black Lives Matter back in 2016, people were saying like, we've never seen this before, right? But the reality is that we actually have seen this before, but then it goes away. It disappears so quickly, right? And so, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement right now is facing its own sort of like tensions and violences, but its cycle makes complete sense, right? The cycle of its life cycle is very much in alignment with the life cycles of movements that we've seen in the past. So I think a lot about that in my own work, because I think that there's a lot of capital in the idea that you can be the first or that something is new. And people benefit from that capital, obviously. And I try to push back against that because I actually think that there's so much more resource in recognizing that none of these things are new and that time is cyclical and we are doubling back on ourselves, because it's what you do with that information. It's what you do with the idea that you're returning back to the past and that history is coming for you that allows you to create and build better movements. So I almost wish that in movements in general, outside of poetry, that we stopped saying that things were new or have never happened or were unprecedented. I wish we just did away with that language because it's never true, one. And two, the fact of that, even if it were true, it's not actually the most interesting thing about time. It's something new being introduced to the sort of like temporal landscape, if that makes sense.
Totally. Thank you. We have some questions from the audience that I'm going to pose. Joshua Karimi asks, is there a relationship between vulnerability and recklessness?
Both can wind up with wounds, for sure. You know what I mean? That DMX thing is interesting because, you know, part of what I was thinking about with that question of the first time you saw that violence is that I really can't remember. So, you know, last year when the George Floyd thing happened, I did an interview with Marie Claire, somebody in France. And at the same time, they were having an anniversary for the previous July where a Black person had been killed. I think it was a sports person by the cops. And I was like, we don't get to have really anniversaries, to go back to this thing about DMX, about like death is behind you and in front of you. So these things happen so quickly that we never pause to be like, oh, this is the day that Trayvon Martin was killed, or this is Trayvon Martin's birthday. I mean, any of these people that we roll through, like ever since Emmett Till, is just part of a kind of continuing cycle So time works that way. And I agree with everything that Camonghne said in terms of how you deal with that. It's good to know that that stuff's behind you and in front of you. How you deal with the changes. That doesn't become the same thing of like resolve. Maybe it becomes revolution, but it's not necessarily resolution, which is what's implied when it comes to the first time, that you can fix it and it'll be done. So I would just add that to that comment. But of course, yes, I think that relationship, recklessness, vulnerability, both you risk some trauma to yourself, to your spirit, to your body, being either one of those things. But I mean, that just comes with living. So I don't know. You just choose the kinds of wounds you're going to take from the world, I guess. So I don't think that those are reasons to avoid it, that you might be wounded by recklessness or vulnerability. Risk is the thing, risk and surprise. I mean, that's what we're really chasing from day to day, I think. Something new, something emotionally risky and surprising. That's what I think anyway.
When Terrance was reading that poem, I just heard something so Black. How can I define what that is? But it's some kind of perfect balance, and maybe between recklessness and perfect control. But I do want to read this poem, which is the last poem in my book. I think it pertains to this conversation. Excuse me. The poem is change, the poem in change. The end of the poem is change. To change in the poem, to change by the poem, to hold the change in the poem, to be changed by the poem, to change by writing the poem, to hold the change in writing, to hold the change by writing, to breathe through the change, to write through the change, to breathe by writing, to write by breathing, to change by breathing. The change is breathing. To hold the breath, to hold the writing, to hold the change, to hold it and let it go. So I just see that in sometimes that poem is right there and the change is just happening all around it. And that's why I think poets are going to change the world, because I believe actually whatever those little things are, the muons or whatever the newest discovery in science is, I believe poets have a lot to do with how the universe is moving.
Thank you so much for reading that, Toi. I think the poem expresses so exquisitely and expansively what talking about a poem cannot express. It's like sometimes we just need to hear we need to hear the poem. And I wonder, we haven't really talked a lot about language and the material of language, but your reading that poem really urges this question for me of why do you think this work at the language level is so important?
I wish Camonghne would read a poem. He was talking about time. You ain't got no poems nearby?
I got some poems nearby. I don't know if I have any poems that are specific to what we were talking about with time, but I will read. Yeah, I will read this poem. So, I think a lot about, Kyle, you just asked, what does language do and how can it function or how can it be useful for change? And one thing I talk about all the time when people ask, why do you think poetry is important in politics, or why are you trying to bring that into the realm, is because I think a thing that poets do that no one else does, right? When poets are writing about bodies, you have to acknowledge whether or not the body is dead or alive or both. Whereas in political conversation, we never actually acknowledge what bodies are physically doing, right? We talk about homelessness theoretically. We don't talk about people who are cold and hungry and are literally experiencing hypothermia. And if we use language that talked about the way that people felt in their bodies and the way that systems are afflicting the way that people feel in their bodies, then maybe we would have better conversations. So One thing that happened a lot in the last year is a lot of just questions that I feel like I have some answers to. And, going back to the idea of vulnerability, I wanted to write some poems that sort of deauthorized me or made me less of a political authority. I think people got really excited about some of the stuff I was doing and decided that I was the president, but I'm not. So I was like, I have questions too, and I want to try to answer them or not answer them. So I'm famously a socialist, and a big part of being a socialist is considering borders and physical borders and how they work. So this poem is called "Do You Believe in Borders?" Which is a thing people asked me a lot last year. Do you believe in borders? What I am feeling is the death of a million wayward bodies falling into each other like lattice work on a French pie. I draw a river and your God lines it out into a field. I say this earnestly and with a smile, so I'm not sure what you're asking me. Is it a question of shoulds or of ours? The nation state is a body. It is the Russian doll of bodies, a body housing a body of farmed bodies, all of whom mill about in their categorical nothingness with some parasite sucking from their breast. All over the globe, one breast drains into the mouth of a whole class, a safety valve for the gutless. You have to understand my parameters here are limited, the space between my two selves shrinking and pulverized all the same. The wine delivery comes. My courier steps into the foyer. I say hello. I say thank you. I sign her receipt. I offer her a Clorox wipe. I stand away at 6 feet. I don't know. I do know nobody dies at my border. That's a poem.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. It was amazing to watch both Toi and Terrance kind of settle into specific moments in your reading. I could just, when you got to the Russian doll of the body, I think all of us went, oof. We all really, we moved with that image.
Yeah. And, just the reason why I talked a little bit about why I chose to read that poem, but really for me, what was really profound in my own political education is to really complicate the questions that you're asking. I think so much of this moment is, bandwagon hopping, and not a lot of people actually doing the hard work of evaluating what they actually believe and why they believe it and the way that their belief functions. And I think that's a big part of what poetry does, is that I think when you come to the page, even if you come to the question, you come with a question, you leave with a kind of answer. It's intellectual rigor that I think a lot of people are allowed to skip. And it frustrates me. So
thank you. Thank you. I want to pose another question from the audience. Jenny asks, can you talk about what elements of the poetic life you see as actionable and or communal, and what elements you see as solitary or deeply personal? And how do the two intersect for you?
You want me to say something? I mean, all my answers are smart-ass answers. Like I would say, the way your relationship to language is, there's all these registers of language, theoretically, the way you talk at work or the way you talk to your family, and then the way you talk when you're praying. So I'm saying one doesn't cancel those things out. Language sometimes goes in one direction, sometimes other, most times all those directions at once. So I guess I'm sort of saying my regular practice is not to ask a whole bunch of answerable questions, I guess. You're mostly just trying to see for me, how much dimension, you can get the words that you're dealing with to have. If that makes any sense. How many shadows you can get a word to cast. Because life is like that, none of the up-down stuff really works for me, good versus bad, black and white. It just turns out that stuff's not super helpful when you just really get into somebody's in your face or somebody's in your heart. A lot of that stuff doesn't work the same. So, and that's Keats' negative capability. I mean, he was 24 coming up with that stuff, and it's still true. So I do find it's hard to answer those kinds of private versus public questions, really. Good in essays, but it's harder to do it when we think about, what metaphor does, which is always blur that line, saying that is like that. So, you don't have to decide.
Toi, do you have thoughts?
Just to say, I rely more and more on something coming from outside. Last week, I lost my phone, and I looked for it for 3 days, and then I finally decided I'd spend the $1,500. I had to do it, and I said, well, before I spend it, I'll stop at Macy's and buy myself something. So I stopped there and I looked at these earrings, and the guy said, I think they're on sale. So I said, okay, I'll buy them. So I said, I'm treating myself to something because I lost my phone and I've been looking for it 3 days and I'm on my way to buy a phone now. And he said, is your name Toi? And I said, what? He said, is your name Toi? He said, yesterday somebody came up to me and gave me your phone.
No, that's crazy.
I swear to God. I swear to God.
That's wild.
The ones who know me believe me. The ones who don't know me think I'm making this up.
I believe.
But sure enough, he called upstairs in the office, and the guy brought my phone down and handed it to me. So that's why I say, and then 2 hours later, I was upset about something and worried whether it would go right. And a voice said to me, girl, you better shut up. You just got your phone back 2 hours ago. You better shut up. So that's how my life is, more and more to wait for this miraculous miracle that's going to happen. And it could be the way a leaf just turns on a tree, or it could be getting my phone back. But you have to pay attention.
I love that. It's 7:00. I think that is a beautiful place for us to arrive, is thinking about this practice of attention. And also I love what you shared, Terrance, about finding how many different shadows a word can cast. I think that those two pieces together just tell us so much of what poetry and protest can do. So I want to thank our three poets, Toi Derricotte, Camonghne Felix, Terrance Hayes. Thank you. Thank you to the National Book Foundation. I think, do I turn things back to you now, Natalie? No. Okay. I want to remind folks to purchase and support the work of these poets. Buy their books for yourself, buy their books for your friends, spread the word. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for getting this together, Kyle. Appreciate you. Natalie, National Book Foundation.
Yeah.